Hello writers, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sandra. I share writing tips, writing inspiration, as well as my creative journey. So today I want to talk about a topic that's very near and dear my heart, and that's poetry. And specifically, I want to talk about how to start writing poetry. So this applies for people that have never written in the genre before, people that are starting to write poetry, people that are interested, newbies, beginners. Doesn't matter if you took a course on poetry, doesn't matter if you haven't, it doesn't matter if you don't study writing, it doesn't matter. I just wanted to make a short and helpful video as to how to start writing poetry. So without further ado, let's get started. My first tip is to read a lot of poetry. Yes, I know you guys are gonna come for me because every writing tip video starts with reading a lot, but it is true. And to be honest, I'm not the only one that says this. Everyone says this. Ask anyone who's written poetry and they'll say the exact same thing, which is to start reading some poems and poetry. So I would strongly recommend reading all kinds of poems, all kinds of poetry. Even picking up a poetry anthology might help you because they'll have all kinds of poets and poems from all kinds of time periods, and even sometimes they give you some notes and they help guide you. So poetry anthologies are a great start. They're about like 1,400 pages long, so you'll have poems of all kinds of writers and all kinds of time periods. I would even recommend reading Insta poetry or TikTok poetry, as long as it's something that you are interested in and as long as it's the type of poems or poetry you want to write. It's okay to pick up whatever you desire, but I do highly recommend reading everything. So reading from old poets to modern poets, to reading some classical poetry, to, you know, like the Shakespeare and sonnets, to modern day poetry. Some of my favorites that you should consider reading: Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, Mary Oliver. Oh my god, there's so many. Frank O'Hara, Ocean Vuong. Like, I could literally go on forever. Edgar Allan Poe. So many. If you want any more recommendation, I will in the future film a poetry recommendation on my other channel, which is Sandra is Book, where I talk about books. So stay tuned for that, and if you really want that, let me know down below in the comments. And then my second tip is to read all the greats as well. Like I said, you know, even if you want to write more like free verse and modern poems, I think that if you really want to grasp poetry and you really want to challenge yourself, you should read all the great poets. And this advice actually comes from the poet Billy Collins, and he says that if you want to get a better grasp at the meter, at how poetry is constructed, how it sounds, how it looks like, definitely read Paradise Lost by Milton. Definitely read Coleridge and Wordsworth. I did a whole seminar in university on Coleridge and Wordsworth, and it's their lyrical ballads from 1798 and 1800. And honestly, it really transformed the way I see poetry. This has been heavily tabbed. I've written stuff. I've done everything with this collection, and honestly, it's reading the long poems is actually gonna teach you a lot about poetry rather than reading just like 2-3 pages. When you read a poem that's almost like a narrative form or a ballad form, and it takes up 10 to 20 and 50 pages even, you start to realize like, wow, we can do this with poems. We can like tell a whole story. We could put so many elements in poetry. It doesn't even have to be real life. It could be like these illusions, it could be paranormal. It just shows you how much you can do, and I really would recommend going to the old guys. So Coleridge, Wordsworth, I will link everything I talk about and everyone I talk about down below, so don't worry if you're getting lost a bit. And in the future, I will also post a blog post to help you even more. And then another great poet that you should definitely read is Shakespeare's and his sonnets. So the sonnet is a special poetry form from the Petrarchian, and it has 14 lines. And I'm not gonna get into the sonnets, honestly, it's just so much to go through, but you have a long reading list if you want to get into poetry that goes from past to present and even in the future. So poetry is not dead. It's getting a big revival lately, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So definitely Shakespeare, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Milton. Those are some of the greats that you should start with. And if you want to see the Billy Collins advice video, I'll link it down below as well. It's very short, it's like 3 minutes. My third tip is to research poetry forms. Like I was saying, you have Shakespeare's sonnets, but it comes from the Petrarchian. You know, that's just one form. You have haikus, you have free verse, you have the epic, you have the pastoral, you have the ballad, you have limericks. There's quite a few forms of poetry out there, so you can have a feast, you can have fun with it, you can research, you can challenge yourself. I think haikus are really a cool one to challenge yourself, but for me personally, I find haikus to be the hardest. I feel like I would be better suited writing a very long poem as to writing a short one. But you see, everyone has their preferences and everyone has like places where they struggle the most with. So maybe some people struggle with having lyrical poems, so they prefer writing free verse and vice versa, right? So honestly, just don't be afraid, research these things. I'll leave links down below. Like, just have fun with it. Poetry is supposed to be fun, it's supposed to be engaging, and it's supposed to be challenging. So research will come a long way. There's a lot of sources that are free online and offline. There are books you can read. I have this book, it's called The Poetic Designs, An Introduction to Meter, Verse Forms, and Figure of Speech by Stephen Adams. I'll link this book down below. This was one of my first poetry books that I've ever read, and it was super helpful when I read it in my undergrad. Now, my fourth tip is to research literary devices. And like I said, you can go to a book like this because it has figures of speech. But what I mean about literary devices is that there's a lot of literary devices. There's not just metaphor and oxymoron and paradoxes. When it comes to poetry, you can play a very long time because there's not just imagery and allegory, there's also poetic schemes. So I'll list you 4 poetic schemes, although there's about like 30 plus of them. I have alliteration, I have anaphora, I have antithesis, and I have apostrophe. So I'm just going to explain the alliteration one, and if you want to know more, like I said, I will be writing a blog post and posting it and linking it down below once it's ready. But just to give you a brief taste, let me explain what an alliteration is. You might have heard of this one before because it's used very often, not only in poetry but in everyday life, and it's really fun to use. So alliteration, it means that it repeats the same letter or sound from the beginning of a word to a close word afterwards. So if this is confusing, let me explain. I have a third channel on YouTube and it's called Sandra's Shelf, and I did that by purpose because, as you can see, Sandra, my name, starts with an S, and shelf starts with an S. So again, we have a brief alliteration, and this time it's only with the letter. You can have alliteration with sound too, and it's always at the beginning of the words that are in close proximity. A few example would be brown book, blue bill. You know, it's just the beginning sounds and beginning letters of close proximity words. I hope this was very simple and straightforward to follow. If not, like I said, there will be sources down below that might explain it better. I'm just going quickly through this video. If you ever want to see an in-depth video of the different poetry forms, or if you want to see an in-depth video of different figures of speech or even schemes of poetry, then let me know and I'll film that in the future as well. But this is just an introductory basis video. And finally, my 5th tip is to don't be afraid to express yourself. Honestly, writing poetry can be very emotional and very raw, and you could have a lot of self-doubt, like, oh, should I be talking about this? Should I be expressing this? Am I the right one to talk about these topics? I feel uncomfortable. I would argue that sometimes poetry is supposed to make you feel uncomfortable as the poet, because you are really exploring something, and you could even be exploring it in such a exaggerate way with the use of metaphors and figures of speeches that it's kind of normal to feel like people might misinterpret your poems, or they might take your poems way too seriously. But just know that even in poetry, there are still some minor differences between you as the poet and the poems that are being published. You could definitely write a poetry collection about topics that are not even close to you, but that you find interesting, and that doesn't mean it reflects you. I understand it is a bit harder when it comes to poetry because poetry is very much the self, but don't be embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed to express yourself, to talk about the things you really want to talk about. I wrote a 30-page poem the other night, like in a frenzy, and actually my vlog will be posting soon about the poems that I was writing and the poetry collection that I'm trying to self-publish. And I've been telling like my friends and my boyfriend, I've been telling him like I don't feel comfortable almost. Like I feel comfortable, I wrote it, I understand why I wrote it, but I don't know how it's going to translate in the collection. I don't know how people are going to see it or how people are going to see me. And that's a very natural thing. Even as someone who's written poetry for over 7+ years, I still have that fear of expressing myself. But when I started writing the poem and I just let myself go for an hour, over an hour, I was like, you know what, this is good. This is what I wanted to write. This is what I needed to write, and I can always edit it, and I can always, you know, perfect the poem. And that's the other thing with the poems, like the first draft is the first draft. It's like the same with novels. Like sometimes the first draft is so shitty, nothing rhymes, nothing seems perfect, but you'll work through it. So don't be afraid to express yourself. Don't be afraid to write freely. I really hope that you found this video helpful. I hope that you will try your hand at poetry, or at least read some more poems and poets. And if you want to share any of your favorite poetry tips, or if you want to share any of your favorite poets or poems down below, feel free to do so. I would love to read more poems and poets that maybe I haven't discovered or I haven't read much of yet, and I'm sure other people would like to know as well. As always, if you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe. Everyone is welcome on my channel, and I would love to have you here. And also, everything that I talk about will always be linked down below, so don't worry, I'm never keeping anyone in the dark here. For now, I'm gonna go and finish my poetry collection, and I'll see you on the next writing video. Bye!